I spent 3 years listening to my stepson call me a useless gold digger. He is 24, loves parading around in his pristine Navy uniform, and thinks I am just a fragile trophy wife waiting to inherit his father's billions. He had absolutely no idea who I really was. So when his classified military dossier landed on my desk with treason charges that could put him in federal prison for life, I smiled. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. My name is Emery Scott. I am 42 years old, and for the past 3 years, I have perfected the delicate art of disappearing in plain sight. To the glittering high society of San Diego, I am simply the elegant, soft-spoken woman who managed to capture the heart of Arthur Vanguard. Arthur is 60 years old, a towering figure in the defense contracting world, a billionaire whose wealth is as vast and imposing as the Pacific Ocean that our cliffside mansion overlooks. Our marriage is viewed through a singular, cynical lens by his peers. They see an older, wealthy man and a younger, impeccably dressed woman, and they instantly write a script in their heads. I play my part flawlessly. I wear the designer gowns, I host the charity galas, and I nod politely when the admirals and politicians talk over me at dinner parties. But the suffocating reality of this elite, airless world is nowhere more apparent than within the walls of our own home, primarily due to one person, Julian. Arthur's son from his first marriage is 24 years old. He recently graduated from his training and was commissioned as an ensign in the United States Navy, serving as a logistics officer. Julian loves nothing more than his uniform. He wears the crisp khaki fabric like a shield of absolute moral superiority, walking through our home with the rigid posture of a man who believes he is single-handedly holding the military together. He is deeply, aggressively proud, completely oblivious to the undeniable fact that his father's immense fortune paved every single inch of his supposedly self-made path. And he despises me. Julian makes no effort to hide his open hostility. He views me as an invader, a modern-day gold digger whose only discernible talents are booking spa appointments and spending his future inheritance. The dining room is his favorite battlefield. Every family dinner is a masterclass in passive-aggressive warfare. "So, Emery," Julian would drawl, swirling a glass of incredibly expensive red wine that his father paid for, "did the masseuse manage to work out that terrible knot in your shoulder today? It must be absolutely exhausting, carrying the heavy burden of my father's black card all over the shopping district." Across the long mahogany table, Arthur's face would instantly darken. The muscles in his jaw would tense, and he would slam his heavy hand down, making the silverware rattle. "Julian, that is enough," Arthur would bark, his voice echoing with the authority of a man used to commanding boardrooms. "You will show your stepmother some respect. Apologize to her right now." But before the argument could escalate into a shouting match, I would always intervene. I would reach out, gently placing my manicured hand over Arthur's trembling fist, soothing his anger with a soft, forgiving touch. "It is completely fine, Arthur," I would say softly, turning my gaze to Julian. I would offer the young officer a serene, entirely impenetrable smile. Julian works so incredibly hard for our country. He is under a lot of pressure. He is just letting off a little steam. Julian would scoff, rolling his eyes at my apparent weakness. He thought my silence was the submission of a dumb, helpless woman who knew her place. He thought my gentle smiles were an admission of guilt. He could not comprehend that I was simply studying him, calculating his flaws, cataloging his arrogance. His disdain finally reached its boiling point during Arthur and my anniversary party. It was a lavish affair, exactly the kind of ostentatious display expected of a billionaire. Hundreds of guests filled the ballroom, Champagne flowed freely, and the elite of the Defense Society mingled under crystal chandeliers. Halfway through the evening, Julian marched up to the microphone, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor. The room quieted down, expecting a heartwarming tribute from the proud son. "I would like to propose a toast," Julian announced, his voice carrying a sharp, mocking edge. He raised his glass high. "To my father, a true titan of industry, and of course, to Emery." He turned to look directly at me, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "I really have to admit, Emery, you have done an outstanding job of successfully looking pretty in formation. You are the perfect static display. So cheers to the most expensive decorative piece my father ever acquired." A collective, uncomfortable gasp rippled through the ballroom. The silence that followed was deafening. Arthur was livid, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson as he started to move toward the stage. I did not react. I did not cry, nor did I cause a scene. I simply maintained my calm, pleasant expression, raised my glass slightly in acknowledgement of his insult, and took a delicate sip of champagne. Then, before Arthur could create a public scandal, I whispered that I had a headache and quietly slipped out of the ballroom. As I walked down the quiet, dimly lit hallways of the mansion, the sounds of the jazz band fading into a dull hum behind me, I felt no anger toward the foolish young boy. I only felt a cold, detached sense of amusement. Julian truly believed my entire existence revolved around picking out floral arrangements and pretending to care about charity auctions. He thought I was nothing more than a fragile, useless trophy. He had absolutely no idea that the glamorous life of a San Diego billionaire's wife was just a convenient, meticulously crafted cover story. It was the perfect disguise for my real work in Washington, District of Columbia, a job that would soon bring his entire world crashing down. 3,000 miles away from the champagne and crystal chandeliers of San Diego, the air in Washington, District of Columbia is cold and sharp. Deep within an unmarked concrete building in Alexandria, Virginia, lies the headquarters of the Naval Logistics and Compliance Agency. The agency does not exist in public directories. We are an independent, highly classified oversight body tasked with hunting the ghosts that haunt the military supply chain. We tear down corrupt defense contractors, dismantle embezzlement rings, and drag crooked officers out of their comfortable offices. Here, I am not the quiet billionaire's wife. Here, I am Chief Scott. I am the head of special investigations. Admirals who command carrier strike groups sit up straighter when my name is mentioned. Over the past 15 years, I have recovered hundreds of millions of dollars in stolen government assets. I do not arrange flowers. I arrange federal indictments. It was a Tuesday morning at exactly 8 o'clock when the secure elevator doors slid open on my floor. My deputy, a former Marine intelligence officer, walked into my glass-walled office. His face was unreadable, a blank slate, but the file in his hand was loud. It was a thick, crimson-red dossier. In our agency, a red border means only one thing: an active national security threat. He placed it squarely in the center of my desk. "This just came down from the director," my deputy said, his voice low. "The situation is completely critical. A massive hemorrhage of tactical assets from the Pacific Fleet Logistics Hub. We are talking about advanced night vision optics, encrypted communication gear, and crates of military-grade munitions disappearing into the black market." I nodded, dismissing him with a wave of my hand. I poured myself a black coffee, sat back in my leather chair, and broke the security seal on the folder. I flipped past the executive summary, my eyes scanning the heavily redacted intelligence reports, looking for the target. The prime suspect. The logistical linchpin who was signing off on the fake cargo manifests. I turned to page 4 and my breath caught in my throat. There, staring back at me from a crisp official Department of Defense photograph, was a familiar face. It was a face I saw every Sunday at the dinner table. It was the face of the young man who had just publicly humiliated me 48 hours prior. Ensign Julian Vanguard. I read the name 3 times to ensure my eyes were not playing tricks on me. I read the charges attached to his naval identification number: conspiracy to defraud the United States government, grand theft of military property, arms trafficking. The charges were staggering. If convicted, he was not just looking at a dishonorable discharge. He was looking at 20 to 30 years in a federal penitentiary. I leaned back, steepling my fingers, and let the cold reality of the situation wash over me. The irony was so sharp it could cut glass. The boy who called me a useless gold digger, the boy who thought he was holding the military together with his pristine uniform, was the prime suspect in a massive treason investigation. And his military file had just landed on the desk of the only woman who could authorize his arrest. The standard protocol was crystal clear. Chapter 4, Section 2 of the Agency Manual. Any investigator with a personal or financial tie to a suspect must immediately recuse themselves. It was a textbook conflict of interest. All I had to do was pick up my secure telephone, call the director, and hand the red folder to another unit. I stared at Julian's arrogant, smiling photograph. If I handed this case to another chief, Julian would be dead meat. The federal machine would grind him into dust. He would be arrested in his dress whites, dragged before a military tribunal, and thrown in a concrete cell before his father could even hire a lawyer. A dark, vengeful part of me wanted to make that call. I wanted to let him rot. It would be the ultimate, effortless revenge. But as I analyzed the logistics logs attached to his file, something bothered me. The supply chain manipulation was far too sophisticated. It involved ghosting container weights, bypassing electronic lock seals, and routing shipments through shell corporations. Julian was arrogant, yes. He was loud and entitled. But he was also incredibly dense. He did not possess the intellectual capacity or the tactical patience to orchestrate a phantom supply ring. He was a pawn. A loud, shiny pawn being moved by a much larger, darker piece on the board. I closed the red folder and made my decision. I did not pick up the phone to recuse myself. Instead, I drafted a classified request to the director of the agency. I invoked a rare administrative clause, requesting absolute independent operational control over the Vanguard investigation, citing my unique deep cover access to the target. I was not going to let a blind system destroy him. If Julian was going to face judgment, I was going to be the judge, the jury, and the executioner. I locked his dossier in my personal safe, grabbed my coat, and prepared to head back to the West Coast. The useless decorative piece was going to work. Operating out of a sterile, anonymous hotel room just 5 miles from the naval base, I transformed from a billionaire's wife back into a shadow. The room was paid for in cash under an alias, equipped with secure encrypted servers and a direct line to my deputy in Virginia. Over the next 72 hours, I barely slept. I sat bathed in the harsh blue light of my monitors, meticulously analyzing over 5,000 pages of encrypted logistics logs, digital requisition forms, and black market transaction ledgers. Every single document bore the digital authorization signature of Ensign Julian Vanguard. On paper, the evidence was absolutely damning. It painted a picture of a greedy young officer systematically bleeding the military dry, routing millions of dollars worth of tactical gear, night vision goggles, and heavy munitions into the hands of private arms dealers. But as I dug deeper into the metadata, the flawless facade of the prosecution's case began to crack. I started cross-referencing the exact timestamps of the digital signatures with Julian's physical whereabouts. According to the naval logs, Julian had personally authorized a massive transfer of stolen Kevlar plating at exactly 3 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday in late October. I paused, leaning back in my cheap hotel chair. I remembered that specific Saturday vividly. Arthur had hosted a massive charity gala for oceanic conservation. I remembered it because Julian had consumed the better part of a bottle of vintage scotch and had passed out on one of the poolside cabanas by midnight. The estate security cameras could easily verify he had not touched a computer, let alone an encrypted military terminal, for the remainder of the weekend. The anomaly repeated itself. Shipments of medical supplies vanished at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on a Tuesday, a time when Julian was documented as being in mandatory physical training on the other side of the base. The truth hit me with the force of a physical blow. Julian was not the mastermind. He was completely innocent of the actual theft. In fact, he was far too careless, far too arrogant, and frankly, far too unintelligent to orchestrate a smuggling ring with a 0.01% margin of error. His digital security tokens had been cloned. Someone with a much higher security clearance had been logging into the logistics network, piggybacking on Julian's credentials, and masking their own digital footprint entirely. I ran a reverse trace on the administrative overrides that bypassed the standard security protocols. Only 3 people on the entire base had the clearance to execute those specific commands. 2 were deployed overseas. The third was the base logistics commander, Captain Thomas Thorne. Thorne was a highly decorated veteran with 30 years of impeccable service. He was a man deeply respected by the admirals and fiercely admired by his junior officers, especially Julian. As I mapped out the illicit financial routing, the brilliant cruelty of Thorne's plan became clear. Thorne knew the investigative agencies would eventually notice the missing inventory. When the hammer fell, he needed a shield. And who makes a better scapegoat than a spoiled, entitled billionaire's son? If Julian was caught, the narrative would write itself. The public and the military brass would immediately assume the rich kid felt he was above the law. Julian's immense family wealth provided the perfect smokescreen for Thorne's own greed. Julian was nothing but a sacrificial lamb being fattened for the slaughter by a wolf he saluted every single morning. While I was dismantling Thorne's ghost network from my hotel room during the day, I returned to the mansion each evening to play my role. It was there that I watched the psychological toll of the military's preliminary internal audit take hold of my stepson. Julian was slowly unraveling. The arrogant swagger that usually defined his walk was replaced by a tense, paranoid shuffle. He stopped eating. Dark, heavy bags formed under his eyes. He jumped every time his cell phone rang. He knew the internal investigators were circling his department, asking uncomfortable questions about missing inventory, and he knew his name was attached to the paperwork. He was trapped in a nightmare, suffocating under the weight of an impending doom he could not understand, yet he stubbornly refused to ask his father for help, terrified of shattering his own pride. The breaking point occurred late on a Thursday night. It was past 1 o'clock in the morning. I was in the expansive kitchen of the mansion, pouring myself a glass of cold water, when the heavy oak front door slammed shut. Heavy, unsteady footsteps echoed across the marble foyer. Julian stumbled into the kitchen. His usually pristine khaki uniform was wrinkled and unbuttoned at the collar. He smelled strongly of stale gin and absolute desperation. His eyes were bloodshot, darting frantically around the room before locking onto me. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. The silence in the kitchen was heavy, broken only by the low hum of the massive refrigerator. Then, his face twisted into a mask of ugly defensive rage. "What are you staring at?" Julian slurred, his voice thick and aggressive. He swayed slightly, grabbing the edge of the granite island to steady himself. "Go ahead. Judge me. You stand there in your silk pajamas, living off my father's bank accounts, acting like you are better than everyone else." I did not raise my voice. I simply turned around and retrieved a dark ceramic mug from the cabinet. "You have absolutely no idea what it takes to survive in the real world," Julian continued, his voice cracking with a mixture of anger and raw panic. He slammed his fist against the countertop. "You do not know what real pressure is. You do not know what it is like to have the weight of actual responsibilities. to have people relying on you, to face consequences. You are just a parasite. A useless, pretty parasite. I placed a fresh coffee pod into the espresso machine and pressed the button. The machine whirred to life, grinding the beans with a loud mechanical crunch. I waited patiently until the steaming black liquid filled the mug. I picked it up, walked around the kitchen island, and set the hot coffee directly in front of his trembling hands. I looked up into his bloodshot eyes. He was a terrified boy pretending to be a soldier, completely unaware that his entire career and his freedom were hanging by a single frayed thread. He had no idea that the noose was already around his neck, tightened by the commander he worshipped. And as I watched a single bead of cold sweat roll down his temple, I felt a chilling wave of calm wash over me. He stood there, cursing my existence, completely blind to the fact that the so-called parasite making his hangover coffee was the only god who could pull him out of the hell he was about to fall into. The game had officially shifted from defense to offense. I needed to isolate Captain Thomas Thorne, to cut off his escape routes before he even realized the air in his room was running out. Operating through heavily encrypted military satellite channels, I activated 3 of my most reliable field operatives stationed covertly in Southern California. I never used my real voice. I communicated solely through secure alphanumeric text relays, directing them to shadow Thorne's civilian associates completely off the base. The puzzle pieces of his corruption fell into place with a dark, satisfying precision. Thorne was not just stealing government equipment, he was laundering the massive profits through a labyrinth of offshore shell corporations. Working late into the night, I tracked a specific wire transfer of $2,500,000. It moved seamlessly from a dummy logistics firm in Panama, bounced through 2 holding companies in the Cayman Islands, and finally landed in a private, untraceable trust fund registered under his wife's maiden name. It was a classic, arrogant mistake made by a man who believed his heavy metals and crisp uniform made him completely bulletproof. I spent 48 solid hours compiling bank records, surveillance photographs, and encrypted server logs. I was building a titanium cage of evidence, a trap so meticulously constructed that when the heavy iron jaws finally snapped shut, Thorne would not even have the breath to scream. While the invisible net tightened around the corrupt captain, the fragile illusion of peace inside the Vanguard mansion finally shattered into a million pieces. The official notification of an impending court-martial arrived by military courier on a Tuesday afternoon. The impact on Arthur was catastrophic. I found my husband pacing the length of his massive mahogany library, his face completely pale and his hands shaking violently. He had his mobile phone pressed tightly to his ear, shouting at his executive assistant to immediately contact the most expensive, high-profile defense attorneys in the United States. He was fully prepared to liquidate $10 million instantly if it meant keeping his only son out of a federal penitentiary. I walked over, my heels silent on the expensive Persian rug, and gently pressed my hand against his arm, forcing him to lower the phone. "Arthur, please stop," I said, my voice steady, reasonable, and completely calm. "You cannot buy his way out of this." "I have to do something, Emery," Arthur pleaded, his eyes wide with a father's raw, unadulterated terror. "They are charging my boy with treason. I will hire an army of lawyers. I will buy the damn court if I have to." "Lawyers cannot fix treason, Arthur," I replied softly, looking directly into his desperate eyes. "If you throw millions of dollars at this investigation, the military brass will only see a wealthy defense contractor trying to obstruct federal justice. It will make Julian look even guiltier. You must let the military handle its own internal affairs. Any outside interference will absolutely destroy him." I did not hear Julian enter the library, but his voice cracked like a whip right behind me. "You would absolutely love that, would you not?" Julian snarled, stepping out of the deep shadows near the doorway. His face was a mask of pure, poisonous hatred. He marched toward me, pointing a trembling finger right at my face. You want my father to just sit back and watch me burn. You want me completely out of the picture. If I go to federal prison for 30 years, there is no one left to challenge you for the estate. You get the mansions, the corporate shares, all the money. This is your ultimate dream come true." "Julian, that is enough," Arthur barked, though his voice cracked and lacked its usual booming authority. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or offer any defensive arguments. I simply looked at Julian's desperate, angry face, offering a blank, impassive stare. My absolute silence only fueled his dark paranoia. He stormed out of the library, thoroughly convinced that I was the evil architect of his demise. That intense paranoia drove Julian to do something incredibly reckless. The following night, while Arthur was heavily sedated with sleeping pills, and I was supposedly taking a long, luxurious bath, Julian picked the brass lock on my private study. He was desperate for leverage. He wanted absolute proof of my greed. He intended to ransack my writing desk, aggressively searching for altered wills, hidden offshore bank accounts, or anything that proved I was siphoning his father's vast wealth behind his back. He slipped into the dark room, using only the weak, narrow beam of his cell phone flashlight to guide him. He pulled open the top drawer of my desk. There were no financial documents. There were no secret estate plans. There was only a plain yellow legal pad. Julian picked it up, ready to toss it aside in frustration, when the beam of his flashlight caught a string of letters and numbers written in my precise, looping handwriting. His breath stopped dead in his throat. His blood turned to absolute ice. Written on the very top line were the characters Alpha Bravo 79er-2. Beneath that was Charlie Delta 44-8. He recognized those specific alphanumeric sequences instantly. They were permanently etched into his brain, haunting his every waking moment and his darkest nightmares. They were the highly classified serial numbers of the missing heavy munition crates from his logistics sector. The exact crates he was formally accused of stealing. The very codes the internal naval investigators had just grilled him about for 6 agonizing hours straight. Julian dropped the legal pad as if the paper had physically burned his skin. His mind completely fractured. How could his father's supposedly useless, airheaded wife possibly know the highly classified serial numbers of stolen military property? She did not even know the difference between a hunting rifle and a standard-issue sidearm. Was she framing him? Was she a covert government informant? Was she something far more dangerous than a simple gold digger? He stumbled backward in the dark, knocking his knee hard against a heavy leather chair, his heart hammering violently against his ribs like a trapped bird. He backed out of the study, locking the heavy door behind him with uncontrollably trembling hands. For the first time in his sheltered, arrogant life, Julian realized he was entirely in the dark, trapped in a terrifying, deadly game where he did not even know who the players were. And he was absolutely terrified to ask a single question. The sky over San Diego was a bruised, heavy purple, perfectly matching the suffocating dread that had settled inside the walls of the mansion. It was exactly 24 hours before the military tribunal was set to convene. Inside his bedroom, Julian was a ghost haunting his own life. The crisply ironed uniform he loved so much hung limply on the closet door like a mocking specter. Sitting at his dark mahogany desk, he stared blankly at a single sheet of paper. It was a formal plea agreement drafted by his newly appointed military defense counsel. The terms were brutal and absolute. Admit to all charges of grand theft and conspiracy. Accept a dishonorable discharge. Serve a minimum of 15 years in a federal military prison. In exchange, the prosecution would not pursue the maximum penalty of 30 years. His hand hovered over the signature line, gripping the pen so tightly his knuckles turned white. He was completely broken. The relentless fight had drained out of his body. He was ready to throw his entire future away just to make the crushing, relentless anxiety stop. Downstairs, the heavy brass doorbell echoed through the quiet halls. I stood in the shadows at the top of the marble staircase, looking down into the grand foyer. Captain Thomas Thorne stood there, dressed in his immaculate service dress blues, his chest heavy with medals he had earned and honor he had long since sold. He had come to deliver the final psychological blow to the family, masquerading as a deeply concerned and grieving mentor. Arthur greeted him with a desperate, crushing handshake, leading the corrupt officer into the formal living room. I quietly descended the stairs, heading toward the kitchen to prepare a heavy silver tray with fine porcelain cups and a pot of hot Earl Grey. I needed a legitimate reason to be in that room. I needed to look the devil directly in the eye. When I entered the living room carrying the silver tray, Thorne was sitting on the edge of the velvet sofa, leaning forward with his hands clasped tightly together. He was wearing an expression of profound, carefully manufactured grief. "Arthur, you have to understand the reality of the situation," Thorne was saying, his voice thick with fake sympathy. "I pushed that boy. I believed in his potential. But the evidence the internal auditors found is absolutely overwhelming. The digital security signatures do not lie. I am entirely heartbroken, but you need to prepare yourself for the worst outcome. You need to start thinking about visitation protocols at the federal penitentiary." Arthur buried his face in his trembling hands, letting out a hollow, agonizing groan that filled the large room. I stepped forward, my posture subservient, my expression completely vacant. I watched Captain Thorne carefully as I poured the tea. Here was a man who commanded hundreds of sailors, a man who wore the flag on his shoulder, yet he was nothing more than a common thief hiding behind his rank. The sheer audacity of his visit, coming into our home to comfort the father of the boy he was actively destroying, disgusted me on a profound level. But my face revealed absolutely nothing. I played the role of the useless, decorative wife to absolute perfection. "Would you care for some tea, Captain Thorne?" I asked, my voice light, delicate, and breathy. Thorne looked up at me, offering a sad, deeply patronizing smile. "Thank you, Emery. You are very kind to offer." I leaned over the low glass table, pouring the steaming amber liquid into his cup. As I handed him the delicate porcelain saucer, I leaned in just a fraction of an inch closer. My voice dropped to a barely audible whisper, meant strictly for his ears alone. "It is such a terrible shame about Julian," I murmured softly, my eyes locking onto his. "Almost as tragic as that unexpected delay with the heavy munitions transfer at Pier Number 4 yesterday at exactly 3 o'clock in the morning. The weather can be so incredibly unpredictable for illicit maritime shipping." The physical change in Thorne was instantaneous and completely terrifying. His hand jerked violently, spilling hot tea over the gold rim of the cup and directly onto his pristine trousers. All the vibrant color drained from his weathered face, leaving him a sickly ashen gray. His eyes snapped up to meet mine, wide with sudden freezing panic. Pier Number 4 at 3 o'clock in the morning was the exact location and time of his latest, most secretive black market handoff. It was a detail entirely absent from Julian's official file. It was a detail only a highly classified ghost could possibly know. I simply smiled sweetly, stepping back and offering him a small linen napkin. "Oh dear, let me help you with that spill." Thorne stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over the heavy glass table in his haste. "I sincerely apologize, Arthur," he stammered, his voice suddenly tight, ragged, and breathless. "I just remembered a highly urgent matter at the base. I must leave immediately." He practically fled the mansion, abandoning his commanding presence, leaving Arthur completely bewildered and staring blankly at the spilled tea soaking into the rug. Later that evening, the heavy, oppressive silence of the house was broken by a sound I had never heard before. I walked into the formal dining room and found Julian sitting entirely alone at the long mahogany table. The arrogant, untouchable naval officer was completely gone. In his place was a terrified, shattered, little boy. He was slumped over the polished wood, his shoulders shaking violently, sobbing with a raw, ugly intensity. The plea agreement was crumpled tightly in his fist. He was mourning the death of his own life. The absolute destruction of his suffocating pride was finally complete. I stood quietly in the arched doorway, watching the enemy who had tormented me for 3 long years completely fall apart. I felt no pity. I only felt the cold, hard resolve of the impending dawn. Julian heard my footsteps and slowly lifted his heavy head. His face was wet and stained with tears, his eyes red and swollen. He looked at me, expecting another sharp insult, expecting me to finally gloat over his total, humiliating ruin. Instead, I kept my voice perfectly level, stripping away the soft, breathy tone I usually used around him. My words were sharp, commanding, and absolute. "Make sure you press your uniform properly tonight," I stated coldly. "Wear it with absolute precision tomorrow morning. Do not embarrass your father again." Julian stared at me, his mouth slightly open, utterly confused by my authoritative tone. He could not comprehend why the woman he thought was a useless parasite was suddenly giving him orders like a superior military officer. He simply dropped his head back down onto the cold table, drowning in his own bitter despair, waiting for the heavy gavel of the military court to end his world. The air inside the military tribunal room at the naval base was entirely stagnant, heavy with the suffocating scent of polished wood and impending doom. It was exactly 9 o'clock in the morning. The harsh fluorescent lights beat down mercilessly on the central wooden table where Julian sat. His posture, usually so rigid and arrogant, was completely shattered. He was slumped forward, his hands folded tightly in his lap, his eyes fixed blankly on the dark grain of the table. He looked like a man already walking to the gallows. At the front of the room, seated behind a massive elevated bench, were 3 senior military judges. Their expressions were carved from solid stone. To the right, standing at the prosecution podium, Captain Thomas Thorne was delivering his testimony. Thorne wore his service dress blues, his chest adorned with rows of shimmering ribbons. His voice was smooth, practiced, and dripping with a sickeningly false sense of paternal disappointment. "It brings me absolute sorrow to stand before this tribunal today," Thorne stated, looking solemnly at the panel of judges. Ensign Vanguard was a young officer with immense potential. I trusted him. However, the internal audit is undeniable. The digital logs clearly show that he used his clearance to bypass security protocols, systematically rerouting highly classified tactical gear and heavy munitions for personal financial gain. He abused his rank, he abused his uniform, and he betrayed the United States Navy. Julian squeezed his eyes shut. He did not have the strength to defend himself. His appointed military counsel sat silently beside him, shuffling useless papers, waiting for the inevitable moment when Julian would be forced to sign his life away. Julian braced himself for the heavy strike of the judge's gavel, waiting for the 30 years of darkness to officially begin. Then, the heavy brass-studded oak doors at the back of the tribunal room swung open with a violent, echoing crash. The sound was so sudden and sharp that every single person in the room flinched. Thorne stopped speaking instantly. The 3 judges looked up, their brows furrowing in deep annoyance at the unprecedented interruption. Julian slowly turned his head, expecting to see his father rushing in with another futile team of civilian lawyers. Instead, he saw me. I was not wearing the soft, flowing designer dresses or the delicate pearls I wore at the mansion. The useless decorative wife was completely dead. I stepped into the harsh light of the courtroom wearing a severely tailored charcoal gray power suit. My hair was pulled back into a strict, immaculate knot. My posture was straight, commanding, and radiating an icy, absolute authority that immediately sucked all the air out of the room. I carried a single, thick red dossier under my left arm. The chief presiding judge, a hardened admiral with 40 years of service, narrowed his eyes. Then, his expression shifted from intense irritation to profound shock. He immediately stood up from his heavy leather chair, his posture snapping into a rigid stance of absolute respect. "Good morning, Chief Scott," the Admiral declared, his deep voice carrying across the silent room. "We were not informed that the Naval Logistics and Compliance Agency was taking over this jurisdiction." Julian stopped breathing entirely. The color drained completely from his face as his jaw went slack. His wide, bloodshot eyes darted wildly between the commanding admiral and me. His mind completely short-circuited, desperately trying to reconcile the terrifying reality unfolding before him. The woman his father married, the woman he had relentlessly mocked for 3 years, the woman he called a worthless gold digger, was not just an investigator. She was the absolute highest authority in the room. She was the most feared phantom in the entire naval justice system. I did not look at my stepson. My eyes were locked entirely on the prosecution podium. "Good morning, Admiral," I replied, my voice projecting clearly, sharp and cold as shattered glass. I walked confidently down the center aisle, the sharp click of my heels echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "I am officially invoking federal oversight on this tribunal, effective immediately. The charges against Ensign Vanguard are entirely fraudulent." I reached the central table and slammed the thick red dossier down with a deafening crack. I turned my head slowly to look directly at Captain Thorne. The arrogant, composed officer from 2 minutes ago was completely gone. Thorne looked as if he had just seen the devil herself. His hands were trembling violently, gripping the edges of the wooden podium so hard his knuckles were entirely white. "Captain Thorne has presented you with digital signatures," I addressed the judges, my tone lethal and precise. What he deliberately omitted was the fact that he used his superior command override to clone Ensign Vanguard's security tokens. He orchestrated a massive ghost network to siphon military assets to private arms contractors. I opened the red folder, pulling out stacks of heavily documented financial records and tossing them across the table toward the bench. "You will find the complete offshore banking ledgers right there," I continued without taking a single breath. $2,500,000 routed through a shell company in Panama, ultimately landing in a private trust fund in the Cayman Islands, registered to Captain Thorne's wife. Furthermore, you will find satellite surveillance photographs placing the captain at Pier Number 4 at exactly 3 o'clock in the morning, personally overseeing the transfer of the stolen munitions crates he is currently attempting to pin on his subordinate. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. It was the sound of a man's entire life being flawlessly, ruthlessly dismantled. Thorne opened his mouth to speak, to offer some desperate, flailing lie, but no sound came out. He was completely trapped in a titanium cage of my design. The Admiral picked up the first page of the banking ledger, his eyes scanning the irrefutable evidence. He looked up, his face dark with fury, and gestured to the 2 armed military police officers standing by the doors. "Take Captain Thorne into federal custody immediately," the Admiral ordered. The heavy metallic click of the handcuffs echoing in the silent room was the most satisfying sound I had heard in years. Thorne offered no resistance. He was a broken man, stripped of his stolen honor, led out of the courtroom in absolute disgrace. The Admiral turned his attention back to the center table. "Chief Scott, what is the disposition regarding Ensign Vanguard?" I finally turned to look directly at Julian. He was trembling, staring at me with a mixture of pure terror and blinding awe. "The ensign is cleared of all criminal charges," I stated firmly. "In fact, Admiral, I personally initiated the immediate administrative hold and suspension of Ensign Vanguard last week. I did not do it as a punitive measure. I issued that order to permanently lock his digital credentials, pulling him out of the logistics chain before Captain Thorne could force him to unwittingly authorize the final, massive shipment that would have buried him forever. The suspension saved his life." The gavel struck the sounding block with a heavy, final thud, echoing through the room and signaling the absolute end of the nightmare. 15 minutes later, I walked out of the heavy courtroom doors and stepped into the quiet, brightly lit hallway. Julian was waiting for me. He was leaning against the cold concrete wall, looking utterly exhausted and incredibly small. When he saw me approach, he immediately stood at the position of attention, his eyes fixed firmly on the floor. He could not even bring himself to look me in the face. Julian started, his voice cracking violently. He swallowed hard, struggling to force the words past the massive lump in his throat. I am so incredibly sorry. For everything. For the things I said. For how blind and stupid I was. I thought you were just... He stopped speaking, unable to finish the sentence. He was drowning in his own immense shame, finally realizing the catastrophic depth of his own shallowness. I walked right up to him. I did not offer him a warm hug. I did not offer any sweet, comforting words or a maternal stroke of his hair. I demanded respect, and I expected absolute discipline. I reached out and firmly grasped the top button of his uniform collar, which had come undone during his panic. With quick, precise movements, I secured the button and sharply adjusted the lapels of his jacket, making sure the fabric laid perfectly flat against his chest. I looked directly into his tear-filled eyes, my gaze steady, unyielding, and fierce. "Arrogance does not make a soldier, Julian," I said, my voice low but carrying the absolute weight of a command. "The uniform does not give you value. Your actions do. Use this second chance to prove I did not waste my time saving a completely useless man." Julian nodded slowly, his posture straightening not out of false pride, but out of genuine, newly forged respect. He finally understood what true power and responsibility looked like. I turned on my heel and walked down the long, sunlit corridor toward the heavy glass exit doors. I did not look back. Pushing through the doors, the warm California sun hit my face, and the cool ocean breeze washed over me. Walking toward my waiting black car, a slow, quiet, and immensely powerful smile spread across my lips. The gold digger was going back to work. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Haley Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.